come. 'Tis grace hath brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we know there's days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. My chains are gone, I've been set free. My God, my Savior, has ransomed me, and like a flood, His mercy reigns, unending love, amazing grace. My chains are gone, I've been set free. My God, my Savior, has ransomed me, and like a flood, His mercy reigns, unending love, amazing grace.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Today we have a relatively brief psalm as we continue making our way through. We're on Psalm 13 this week. Yet another, as most towards the beginning of the book are, attributed to David. It's rather evident that as you read through it, that this particular psalm was composed during a time of persecution on the part of the psalmist, so much so that it seems from his perspective that God has turned away completely. Some, like others we've seen, suggest it was written when David was being pursued by Saul. Like I told you all at the very beginning, if you had a nickel for every psalm that's attributed to David's flight from Saul, you'd be rich. We simply don't know. Just kind of a brief overview of it. It does differ a bit from Psalm 12 and 9 and 10 before that, as we discussed, because yet again here in 13 we're back to a problem that seems to be more personal for the psalmist. We had discussed with the last psalm, again going back to Psalm 10, 9 and 10 before it. It seems to be persecution and wickedness and problems on a far grander scale, right? An entire society in which the wicked are running amok, taking advantage of the poor and the needy, oppressing and abusing them. Here in Psalm 13, it seems to be back to the psalmist. Not to say that one isn't personally affected by broader problems, but it's within the scope of the psalm itself. So let's read through it, and then we'll note the outline and work our way through. How long wilt thou forget me, O Lord? Forever? How long wilt thou hide thy face from me? How long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart daily? How long shall mine enemy be exalted over me? Consider and hear me, O Lord my God. Strengthen mine eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death. Lest mine enemies say, I have prevailed against them, and those that trouble me rejoice when I am moved. But I have trusted in thy mercy. My heart shall rejoice in thy salvation. I will sing unto the Lord, because he hath dealt bountifully with me. So again, as I was just saying, a psalm that is back to what we've seen in some of the previous ones, more the psalmist's own personal situation, rather than that of everyone else around him. It could be the case, but we don't find it here. A very, very simple breakdown of this one, again, if you're a fan of alliteration in particular. It breaks down into three two-verse sections, handily, starting out with a protest in verses 1 and 2, followed by a prayer in verses 3 and 4, and then concluding with praise, verses 5 and 6. And that kind of fits what we've seen too. A lot of the other Psalms even if they're written in what's clearly a desperate time in the psalmist's life, a desperate situation, things are going terribly, terribly awry, they tend to end on a positive note. If you recall last week, that's one of the things that made Psalm 12 somewhat unique with what we've seen up to this point, in that it didn't. So here with 13, we're back to that we've become accustomed to seeing. It's clear, the first two verses, that it's starting out with a protest. How long, right? This question, some form of this question appears 4 times in the first 2 verses, and it's evident that from the psalmist's perspective, it seems that his trials are never going to end, that they're just going to keep going on indefinitely. Has God forgotten him? Does God not see what's happening? How will you forget me forever? The very thought is downright terrifying. Especially as we've seen in some of the other psalms, how much the psalmist relies upon God, and how as he concludes the psalm, looking toward the future, how God has dealt bountifully with him, has been merciful to him. The thought that God may have forgotten is not a pleasant one. How long wilt thou hide thy face from me? Right. So it's this sense. Does God not see? Is God not willing to turn and look upon him? It's reminiscent, I think, of what you find as we discussed with the last psalm, though for a different reason. In some of the writing prophets, Jeremiah, Habakkuk specifically come to mind. But in Psalm 12, you got a bit of that because, again, of this focus upon the poor, the needy, those who are being abused, oppressed, those who rule over them are not judging their cases fairly, they're extorting them, taking advantage of them. A problem that you find much more prevalently in the writing prophets, the literary prophets. Here in verse 13, this sense of how long is God going to let this bad situation continue before he steps in and does something about it? You get a bit of that here in Psalm 13, and it also reminds me a bit of Job. And you have to remember, as you go through the book of Job, Job himself was not privy to what we as readers are in the first chapter, in which, in getting introduced to this before all of the terrible events befall Job and those around him, why this is happening to him. And as you go through this book and his friends come and they're trying to puzzle out why all these terrible things have happened to Job. You get a bit of a sense of this as well. Job, it's crystal clear, is a good man. He's been righteous. He's one who loves God and who has sought to do God's will. So why are these bad things happening? And and perhaps more of the point is, we kind of compare it to Psalm 13. Why isn't God answering? Why isn't God giving him any indication of why these things are happening, and when the tide may turn? So certainly the psalmist is feeling dejected and perhaps even abandoned. Again, keep in mind how the psalm ends, right? But here in the beginning, God has seemingly forgotten him in his hour of need. So we start out with that protest, right? He's been seemingly forgotten. God has turned his face. How long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart daily? Right? How long is he going to have to handle things on his own? Right? To guide his own steps, as you were thinking back to Jeremiah. How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? Again, which implies that his enemy, at the point in time he's writing this, is winning, right? Again, if you think about David fleeing from Saul, that would certainly be the case. Likewise, I suppose if you think of David fleeing from his son Absalom in Absalom's rebellion, at that point in time, things were not going his way. The enemy certainly had the upper hand. But then he turns. Verses 3 and 4 from protest to prayer. Consider and hear me, O Lord my God. So he's appealing to God, right? Even though he said, have you forgotten me? Why won't you turn your face? Yet he prays to God and says, consider and hear me. He hasn't given up, right? He's still going to make this appeal. Lighten my eyes lest I sleep the sleep of death, right? So here's what's weighing upon him. His enemy has the upper hand. Things are not going well, clearly. And there's the very real prospect that he could lose his life. It would seem to be the case that whoever this enemy is, whoever's pursuing him, whatever the circumstance, he's in grave physical danger. And if something doesn't happen to change his situation, he's going to lose his life. Lest mine enemies say, I have prevailed against him. And those that trouble me rejoice when I am moved. Again, if something doesn't happen to change the circumstance, the situation here, he's going to die. His enemy is going to gain the upper hand. And I can't help but think here a bit of Abraham. When he's pleading with God not to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, right? His nephew Lot lived there. You recall he tries to bargain with God. If I can find 50 righteous people, 40, 30, 20, and so on until he couldn't even find 10. He poses this question. If you do this, without cause, if there are righteous people here and you destroy them too, then what will the heathen say, right? All of the people round about who are seeing what's happening, you're surely not going to be unjust and destroy these cities when there are righteous people to be found in them. You're going to give the enemy cause to gloat. You want them to see a just and good God, a merciful God. And of course, we discussed in a sermon just a couple of weeks back some of the problems in Abraham's reasoning on that particular occasion. But I can't help but think about that a bit, right? The psalmist puts his trust in God, right, to deliver him from whatever the situation at hand is. Lest mine enemies say I prevailed against him, and those that trouble me rejoice when I am moved. Right? I mean, yes, it's certainly going to reflect poorly upon the psalmist if the enemy overtakes him, but he's also putting his trust in God, right? So I can't help but think of that just a bit. It also reminds me in our Galatians class in Galatians 2, there at the Jerusalem conference when there are some, Paul says, men who were brought in privily to spy out their liberties in Christ. Those are the Judaizing doctrine, as we call it, who wanted to compel Titus to be circumcised. And Paul would not let that happen. Why? Because he knew that if they acquiesced, they gave in, and they did it, it would give their opponents cause to declare victory, to gloat, to say, well, look, we do have the upper hand, we came out on top, right? It says, those that trouble me rejoice when I am moved, right? That is to say, they won, right? They came out on top, and that's certainly something that the psalmist doesn't want to happen for obvious reasons, for his own personal safety, but also because he's the one who puts his trust in the Lord and wants to do what's right. He concludes verses 5 and 6 with praise. But I've trusted in thy mercy, my heart shall rejoice in thy salvation. I will sing unto the Lord because he hath dealt bountifully with me. Again, despite the circumstances, despite the fact that he's evidently feeling forgotten, that God has turned his face away, that there's the very real prospect that he can die, that his enemy is going to prevail, and in prevailing that his enemy will rejoice over that victory. He speaks of God's mercy, salvation, and bountiful dealing with him as if it's a foregone conclusion, right? It's already happened. He talks about it in the past tense. He talks about the mercy in the past tense. My heart shall rejoice in thy salvation. I'll sing the Lord because he hath dealt bountifully with me. So a mix there. God's been merciful to him in the past. My heart shall rejoice future in thy salvation. I will sing unto the Lord because he hath dealt, past tense, bountifully with me. Right, so he has this tremendous confidence, this praise of God. Again, his deliverance, his ultimate victory in this situation is something he's banking on it, right? It is so far as he is concerned a foregone conclusion. Okay, so some lessons that we can take from this brief but powerful song. Sometimes it seems like God isn't there, that he isn't watching, that he does not see what's going on. He doesn't see the circumstances in which we find ourselves in this life when we feel alone and abandoned. But rest be assured that he is. Matthew 28:20, right? Lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the world. Hebrews 13:5, right? He will never leave us nor forsake us. Certainly at this point in time, David felt forsaken. And yet again, he clearly understands that is not the case. Evil people may overcome the righteous momentarily, but that's no indication that God has failed or that he's failed to keep his promise. There are times when there seems to be no help forthcoming from God, when it seems like he's waiting too long to respond. Again, see the book of Habakkuk, the Old Testament prophet. That's precisely the sense that you get there, very similar to Psalm 13. And it seems like the enemy has won, right? The wicked triumph. The righteous are downtrodden and defeated, and God is nowhere to be found. And this leads to his next point here. The Lord may not come to us when we think he ought to come, but he is always on time. One of the recurring themes you find throughout Scripture, particularly in the Old Testament. And here's a good one. We'll close on this one. Note, and if you jotted down the outline, you see this already. The psalmist passes from protest to prayer, and from prayer to praise. And that prayer in the middle, I think, is what helps to make that progression, right? It's hard to go from straight from protest to praise. That is to say, I'm down and out. My enemies are prevailing. God has forgotten me. He's turned his face away from me. Everything's going wrong, and I'm just left here. I'm left here all alone with no help whatsoever. It's hard to jump straight from that to where he ends, right? Trusting in God's mercy, heart rejoicing in my salvation, singing to the Lord because he's dealt bountifully with me. There's that prayer in the middle, and that makes a tremendous difference. So sometimes if you find yourself in a similar circumstance to the psalmist, hopefully not quite as dire as David's when he was one of these occasions when he's fleeing from someone seeking to take his life, but nonetheless, you find yourself in this situation where you would ask, how long will you forget me, O Lord? How long will you hide your face from me? And you think to yourself, I want to have the psalmist's confidence. I want to be able, like David, to say that I trust in God's mercy, that he's dealt bountifully with me and I'll sing unto him. I want to have that kind of confidence. Might I suggest that the biggest lesson of all from Psalm 13 is to spend that time in prayer and meditation, because that's a big piece of being able to go from the one state to the other. All right, so that is Psalm 13, a relatively brief one. Lord willing, we will continue next week looking at Psalm 14. And that's an interesting one. We have an interesting New Testament tie-in there. But we'll look at that next week. Thank you.
Over all the earth you reign on high, every mountain stream, every sunset sky. But my one request, Lord, my only aim, is that you'd reign in me again. Lord, reign in me, reign in your power over all my dreams. In my darkest hour, you are the Lord of all I am. So won't you reign in me again? Over every thought, over every word, may my life reflect the beauty of my Lord. 'Cause you mean more to me than any earthly thing. So won't you reign in me again? Lord, reign in me, reign in your power over all my dreams. In my darkest hour, you are the Lord of all I am. So won't you reign in me again? Lord, reign in me, reign in your power over all my dreams. In my darkest hour, you are the Lord of all I am. So won't you reign in me again? You